Hello, and welcome to the Compass PD podcast, where we dive into evidence based practices and research driven strategies that empower educators and leaders to make a lasting impact. I am Dr. Natalie Fallert, your host, alongside Dr. Sherri Lorton, Constance Hallemeier, and Dr. Stephanie Evans. Today, we are exploring the recent NCTM position statement that was released last month in December of 2024. Whether you're a teacher, administrator, or district leader, our goal is to provide you with insights and tools that help you navigate the complexities of education and inspire student success. In December 2024, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics released a position statement regarding the organization's beliefs, recognizing the important role of educators in ensuring students with disabilities have access to grade course level standards and high quality instruction. Today, we have three individuals who collectively have more than 90 years in education with an emphasis in math, here to talk about this statement, what it means for educators, and why it is important, and how teachers can prepare to make a plan to best meet the needs of all of our students. But before we dive into that, I just want to say hello and welcome, and let each one of them say hello to all of you guys.
Hello.
That's Dr. Sherri Lorton.
Hi,
Hi,
I'm Constance
Dr.
Hallemeier. I've been teaching math, secondary math for 30 years.
Bless you.
Stephanie Evans here. I'm happy to be here talking with all of you today.
Perfect. With this episode, we really want to think about what does this mean for educators and how can we prepare and make a plan moving forward in response to this. So I know that whenever I first read this statement, I kind of was asking what is this position statement? Why are they coming out with it? What is it? Could you guys give us a little bit of information on what does this mean and why is it important and what is the statement actually saying?
NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, partnered with the CEC, or the Council for Exceptional Children, to create 3 declarations about teaching students with disabilities. They include students with disabilities have a right to access and be provided with appropriate supports to be successful with grade and course level content. Students with disabilities have a right to high quality instruction, aligning with content and intervention designed to facilitate success with grade level content. Notice that emphasis on grade level content. So we're really working to raise the bar to help all of our students meet that grade level content. And then the last declaration is students with disabilities have a right to be supported by educators who believe in their ability.
And it's also important to note that these recommendations are best for all students, even if they do not have a special education diagnosis. Believing in all students creates an environment where all students can learn. Collective teacher efficacy is the collective belief of teachers in their ability to positively affect students. And with an effect size of 1.57, collective teacher efficacy is strongly correlated with student achievement.
So this statement, it's really important because currently in many districts, we kind of have a disconnect and a lack of collaboration between what is happening in the regular education classroom and the special ed classroom, especially in mathematics. So we know that students with disabilities, they should be instructed by teachers with strong content and pedagogical content knowledge. But if you think about it, because our teachers come from different coursework, so our SPED teachers have different coursework than our regular education classrooms and those preparation programs. And so that results in them entering the field with differences in their knowledge about mathematics, education, or special education. There's that disconnect there. So this statement being made through a partnership with the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and the Council for Exceptional Children is really a first step in starting that collaboration between SPED and regular education teachers. And so prompting that to begin to happen in our districts and in our buildings.
So one of the things that I'm hearing is that this statement is really pushing, making sure that all of our kids are getting grade level, course level appropriate education. I loved the fact that they really talk about that collective teacher efficacy, because I know here at Compass, we love Hattie and we love looking at that. And we know that whenever all of our teachers are on the same page and they have the same beliefs, that we can move mountains with our students. One of the things that I think that Stephanie Evans talked about was that education. And I know that, with English, like we teach the same thing over and over and over again. The books just get a little bit harder. But when you start getting higher in those math classes, that algebra 1 is different than geometry, is different than algebra 2 and trig and all of these different things. And so to expect someone with just I say just, but like that's like asking an elementary teacher to teach algebra 2, or they're not well versed in that area, because our math teachers take courses specifically to help with that. Am I wrong in thinking that, Constance?
No, that's absolutely correct. And I was going to just validate that. As a math educator, to get my certification, I had to take so many math classes, but a special education teacher takes classes about how to teach the exceptional child, as opposed to taking content specific classes. And many of them are certified K-12. And so their content knowledge is everything at all levels, which makes it tremendously hard to have a deep level of understanding in specific content areas.
I think that that's also important, that they're coming out with this statement and that they partnered with this other organization, because it is saying that you can't do one without the other, that you need both that content expert and that expert in those instructional strategies for students with either disabilities or exceptional students. We're talking about kids on both ends of that spectrum. So I think that that is extremely important. Now we kind of are going to go into this second question. What should districts do to prepare or ensure that they are in alignment with the National Council of Teacher of Mathematics and the CEC's recommendations? And those of practitioners who are doing this work right now, what are some of the things that they are doing that they're noticing are working well? Or even, I don't know if you are going to address this, if they've tried things and they're like, yeah, this didn't really work, we need to go a different direction. One of the ways we kind of have organized this podcast is to kind of look at each one of those declarations and talk about them.
So this first chunk is all about the district. Like, what are some recommendations that that NCTM and CEC recommended for the districts to do? The first recommendation was that districts ensure the delivery of ongoing professional learning on evidence-based mathematic practices, including practical hands-on experiences. So working with some school districts, special education leadership teams, they've been working on developing professional learning that aligns to content-specific instruction. So working there, and particularly in secondary, middle school and high school, making sure that the special education teachers who are teaching math, either in a co-taught setting or a direct instruction setting, are collaborating with those grade level teachers to understand that content, so that they can teach it to the same level that the regular classrooms are teaching it, or at least in the progressions to get to where the regular classrooms are getting. And then modeling how to progress that learning from concrete to semi-concrete to abstract, because in math, those are the 3 levels. Most students start off in that concrete, something manipulative, hands-on. They move into semi-concrete, maybe visuals, but not tactile, and then abstract, where now we've started into variables, helping our regular ed teachers understand how to work with special ed students, and helping special education teachers who might not have a background in math know how to work with all of those different modes of teaching becomes important. And professional learning is something that becomes a valuable tool in helping bridge that gap.
Question on that. Depending on that professional learning, it almost sounds like there's possibly 2 folds here. One could be that the content teachers and the special ed teachers come together and they're almost like teaching the teacher, but flipping, going back and forth. But then there is another layer of maybe seeking outside help to come in and also offer that professional learning. So that professional learning could go in two ways. Number one, in-house of how do I model and coach back and forth between those two departments. But then would it also be safe to say that if you're noticing gaps, like how do you bring in professionals to help fill those gaps?
Absolutely. And that's oftentimes that bridge between, because our math teachers are very knowledgeable in their content, and our special education teachers are very knowledgeable in modifications and accommodations to support their students. But then there's that gap. How do we help these guys and these guys meet together in the middle? A third piece, because co-teaching is a mode of teaching, or inclusion is a method to have regular ed classrooms with a special education co-teacher so that they work together and support the special education students within the regular education classroom. And some teachers are asked to do that, but not provided any instruction on how to do that. And that's another piece of professional learning that I feel like would be beneficial to help bridge that gap between special ed and regular ed.
Dr. Evans, I don't know, you work a lot more with elementary. So I think my question would be to you on that professional learning, would it be similar at that level, or is it a little bit different when we're talking about elementary and that professional learning that would need to take place?
Well, so currently when our districts adopt a new math curriculum, oftentimes when we are getting professional development on that new curriculum, our SPED teachers aren't necessarily included in that professional development. And so I think moving forward, as we're thinking about that co-teaching partnership, that'll be a piece that will need to be included. So as you're adopting that new curriculum, including those SPED teachers in the professional development of that. One area that is probably new to some of our teachers, regular ed teachers, is part of the recommendation of incorporating that universal design for learning framework in our unit and our lesson planning. And so I feel like there's going to need to be a lot of professional development in this area for that to happen. And so that universal design for learning is a curriculum design, development and delivery framework that's recommended in our statement from the NCTM. It's created to support the accessibility of course content and materials and to sustain that development of our expert learners. And so it's really the goal of that universal design for learning is developing that learner agency that's purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, and strategic and action oriented. And so it goes along with some of this co-teaching and partnership that we're talking about with SPED teachers and regular teachers as we're working together to kind of create those expert learners, do some of that proactive planning and helping those students enable their access to the curriculum. It's also discussing that, providing that flexibility in helping students get to those learner outcomes and thinking about addressing our expectations in structure, and also includes that frequent and varied assessment. So this whole component of this framework is a piece that I feel our regular ed teachers will need some professional learning on as well.
So Dr. Lorton, I know that you were a content coordinator, correct? And overseeing
Yes.
math. And so do you have any insight from that perspective of navigating this professional learning in a K-12 setting when it sounds like there are lots of needs? Like, is there a place you would start? Or I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Evans as far as, in an ideal world, we start with when a new curriculum is adopted, all teachers, whether they're, teaching math specifically or supporting students who have IEPs, they need to be included in that professional development so that they understand and they're hearing the same things that those math teachers and in the elementary setting, classroom teachers are hearing, and they're able to share ideas with one another. As Constance was saying earlier, that them being able to collaborate and share ideas is a really important part of that.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and this is something else that I'm thinking about because I'm more English based, and I was a coordinator that oversaw actually only 612, but this is something that is probably a whole nother podcast. But when we're thinking about it from a district level, it sounds like it would be really important to make sure that we're all aligning so that we are not rolling out brand new content, brand new curriculum, brand new resources in multiple areas at once, because a lot of times our special ed department does service English, social studies, math, science. And if you're rolling out 4 brand new curriculums or resources, where do they put their time and energy? And we already know that our teachers are spread thin right now. And if you're an elementary teacher and you're rolling out 5 different contents or curriculums or resources, where do they put their time and energy? And so I think from a planning perspective and that bigger picture, that's also something that needs to be put on radars of administrators and coordinators so that they're not overwhelming everybody and putting too many things on people's plates.
Completely agreed, Natalie. And one thing that one of the districts I'm working with, their SPED leadership team, is embedding in the curriculum writing process wherever they are. Like, what phase are they in? Inviting special ed teachers in at that point. So if they've already adopted a resource, maybe invite the special education to be part of reviewing that resource, building in the supports that are needed to help the special education students get to that content level experience, even if they've missed some of the phases, but starting now.
And I will say that, Dr. Evans talked about universal design, and I think that that is something that every teacher can use, and you can use it in any content area. So any practices that you learn in that setting or in that realm, I think are good instructional practices for all students, and they're transferable. And so that's nice. It's not like we're adding one more thing on your plate just because of math. It's no, these are good supports and instructional strategies that any student would benefit from. So I know the next kind of bullet is that we build supports for regular collaboration between general education and special education teachers of mathematics, regardless of service delivery models. So I know that what does service delivery models mean? I guess would be a question that I have. And I don't even know if you were going to answer that, but maybe explaining that a little bit more in layman's terms, and then also answering that question.
And so it's funny because when I read that, I was like, oh, I've never heard of it referred to that way. But in my mind, I'm thinking whether the student is direct instruction with a special education teacher, whether they're in what some districts can call an inclusion model, which would be the special education students are in a classroom with like a para or an IA, a paraprofessional or an instructional assistant support, or a co-taught class or a class within a class model where there is a regular education teacher and a special education teacher. So those are the ones that I have seen. Dr. Lorton and Dr. Evans, are there others that you guys have seen somewhere else?
Yeah, I think those cover, those are the kind of the big ones. And then within those, there's kind of probably some subcategories like, they spend part of the time in the classroom for the main part of the lesson, but then they may be pulled out for additional support that go along with their goals that are listed on their IEP. But yeah, that kind of falls within those categories as well.
Also the pull out versus the push in model. That's an area, especially in elementary, where students or SPED teachers may push into classrooms and work with students in the regular setting rather than pulling students out to pull them into a more smaller group setting. So I think those are the other two that I think of when I think about delivery models.
That district recommendation from NCTM brings me to think about how some of the buildings I've worked with, that they work hard at grade level and content area professional learning communities to include a special education teacher to focus on that given content area. So for example, if we have a special education teacher whose focus is on getting students ready for Algebra 1, but is doing direct instruction, they would be then part of the PLC for the Algebra 1 group, so that they can start to see what things would be needed for their students to move up. They can also contribute ideas for incorporating the universal supports or the universal design for learning into classrooms, as well as like what modification suggestions for students for disabilities with disabilities that they have, because those regular education teachers may not know the best modifications for a student, but the special education teacher would have a better insight into them.
Yeah, and in buildings where that professional learning community that includes the team of teachers working with special education students, if that's not yet happening, then administrators can work on scheduling. That's something that seems to begin really now for next year, to ensure that there is adequate time for teachers of special education and the classroom teachers to collaborate together. They can plan together, they can share strategies, as Constance just mentioned, and that gives them the ability to talk about how specific students that they work with together how they learn best and how to grow their students to their optimal potential.
So I think that it would be cognizant for administrators to also keep in mind how thin they're spreading their special ed department. That if you're sending them into a science classroom and a social studies classroom and an English classroom and then a math classroom, like that's a lot of content, especially at that secondary level for them to cover. And so keeping that in mind, and I know that scheduling is hard and it is the beast, and it's like the dirty word of education if you're talking to administrators, and so they probably hate us right now or hate me right now. But if we really want to do what's best for students, then we should try to make a concerted effort to make sure that like we've got special educators who are focusing on math or focusing on math and science, or so that they have that opportunity to PLC and they're not spread so thin.
I completely agree with that, Natalie, because those professional learning communities help to create that collective teacher efficacy Dr. Lorton talked about earlier, that we can use to help our students. We want to make sure that we're all believing that all of our students can be successful, because when we start sharing students during that tier 2 intervention time, if your building has that time, or even before and after school support time, if we all believe that all of our students can do, then we're helping our students find that success.
Another area that I feel like kind of fits with this in the supports for that regular collaboration is pulling in, and something that I kind of looked at as I was looking at this position statement is what information or recommendations that we have from the What Works Clearinghouse. That is that organization that provides that evidence-based practice that helps us tailor our instructional approaches and intervention programs. And so when we think about our tier 2 and our tier 3 intervention programs, as we're collaborating together, thinking about how we're providing that systematic instruction during intervention. So I was a little surprised in the statement to not hear that exact language anywhere, providing that explicit and systematic instruction, because that is such a huge component of our intervention techniques that we use with students. So I wanted to for sure bring that up. The other piece that the What Works Clearinghouse component is the teaching that clear and concise mathematical language. So as we're collaborating together with our SPED teachers, how are we incorporating that same mathematical language and ensuring that we are using that same language to help them understand and communicate? And then we already talked about that concrete, semi-concrete representations. The other piece that's interesting in the What Works Clearinghouse is the number line work. And I'm not sure that we're seeing that in both the SPED setting and the regular ed setting of using that number line to help. And then that delivered instruction on word problems. And so sometimes when we are isolating based on skill, we tend to move to most of just the computational aspect and not pulling in some of those word problems or real word things into it. So that collaboration and support might be a piece of that we're working on, is incorporating those word problems in with our SPED teachers. And then the other component is regularly timed activities to work on that building fluency in mathematics, which in our curriculums now, fluency is a more major component. We're seeing that pulled in more often. And so collaborating with our SPED teachers on those components as well.
So two things that, especially Dr. Evans just mentioned that resonated with me as an English teacher is we work with a district that has a large population of ESL students. And when you mentioned that having that consistent language is, I think, extremely important for all students. But if you have students who are speaking another language, and then you've got math teachers or a special ed teacher and a math teacher both coming in and speaking different languages, so or not different languages, but using different words to describe the same thing, that could be extremely frustrating and confusing for a student. And so I know that we're really talking about special educators and doing this work, but I think it would also be important to think about your ESL teachers, because these kids are still doing word problems and they're not speaking English. And so what does that look like? So I think that that is also important to keep in mind, that when we are talking about this, it really does stretch across all of our educators in our building. Another thing that you kind of mentioned was that regularly included, like, giving kids practice time. And when I asked you guys to define those delivery modes, in my mind, I'm thinking, all right, if a kid's moving, like, I know how hard it is just to transition in a classroom. Sometimes you try to get it down to like 15 seconds. Can you move from here to there? So if kids are moving out of the classroom and then coming back in, that's time lost practicing. And so that's a whole nother layer to be thinking about. I don't know. So again, like I said, we could go down a rabbit hole of different things, but these are just things that are coming up in my mind as an educator, as a parent, that you guys are touching on. I'm like, oh my gosh, if you're moving, that's less time you get to practice, or it's less time you're getting direct instruction or added supports or whatever.
And Natalie, I really, as I read this from a math teacher perspective, I really was thinking, oh, these statements are really for just our math learning disabled students. But as I listened to Dr. Evans talk, even Dr. Lorton, when we're talking about scheduling and we're talking about these interventions, just making sure that we're thinking about our speech and language students, where that clear and concise math language will help our speech and language students. The word problems, deliberate instruction on word problems, that's going to help our students who are reading comprehension disabled. And so not just the LD math kiddos, these instructional things that we can do to support that with that regular collaboration is going to help not just our LD math.
Okay, so moving on to the next bullet, it's like, to ensure funding and resources for high quality instructional materials, including assistive technology, is one of the declarations from NCTM.
NCTM, yes. So this is under one of the declarations. This is one of the suggestions for the district level to support with helping to bridge these gaps. And one of the special education departments that I'm working with, they are working to become part of that curriculum writing process. I've talked about it a couple of times. Within that curriculum writing process, they will actually be able to look at the standards. Some of our special education teachers focus so much on the goals that their students have that sometimes they don't have time to look at those standards. So having a teacher on the curriculum writing process will help them be able to look at those standards the same time that the regular education teachers are looking at the standards, which then will help them create progressions for their students. It'll help them be able to modify the assessments, to know where are some give and takes, what are the nice to knows, what are the need to knows, and then helping to select resources so that our special education students, again, like Dr. Evans said, aren't hearing a different language than our regular education students, so that they're mirroring that language. If we have similar resources that can help them, help our special education teachers ensure that all students have access to grade level instruction.
Yeah, and for those who provide their own special education teachers within their district, making sure to include district administrators during that process of adapting adopting materials is helpful as well. Some districts have a separate entity that works with them to provide services to students with IEPs, and many districts do that in-house. But in cases where it is a separate entity, making sure to include the teachers or the administrators who work specifically in their schools as they go through that adoption process is very important.
And right now, districts can be focusing on ensuring that our programs that we are currently using or are planning to use in the future are accessible for all learners. And so there is a date by which all school districts must adhere to that accessibility. And it's April 2026 for larger school districts and April 2027 for smaller school districts. And so when determining funding and what to purchase, as we're thinking about how to ensure we have that funding and resources for those high quality instructional materials, that piece will need to be considered, that it's accessible for all learners, because some of our programs now are not. And before we were able to get away with that, but soon we're going to be held accountable for that.
Dr. Evans, so you're kind of saying review what you currently have in place to make sure that it meets these requirements. But I think my second question is that that deadline that you just stated, is that like we're all from Missouri? So is that a Missouri thing or is that a national thing?
You know what, Natalie? I would have to look into that. You know, when you know something and you don't know if you know it just for your area or so, that's a really good question. I would have to look into that. I do know that accessibility, like it is a nationwide issue. I don't know necessarily that those dates are required for all states.
It's good practice anyways to making sure, like,
Sure.
let's just face it, like if it's not accessible to all of your students, then we need to relook at it and examine it. So when looking at those accessibility things, is there like a protocol or a place that they could go and to see whether or not it meets these standards?
Well, as we're looking at new curriculum for our districts and districts that we're working with, many times you have a director of accessibility and you work really closely with them for making sure that the programs we're using are aligned.
I know that Dr. Lorton kind of mentioned this, and so I just wanted to touch on it a little bit more. We've worked with districts where there's literally a special education district, and it then takes teachers and puts them in other districts. So it's kind of like two districts working together. And I've worked in situations where, as a coordinator, where I've had to manage both that. And it is really hard from an administrative standpoint because they have their own funding sources, they have their own rules, they have their own professional development needs. And then as a district, you're working with these people and you have your own needs and expectations and funding sources. And so that can become very hairy and cumbersome and I've also worked in districts where we're said district and we have all of our teachers, all of our special education teachers are all getting the same paycheck under the same umbrella, and it's nice and neat and tidy. But there are districts that have to work in a different setting, and we just want to acknowledge that that can be hard. And but that doesn't mean we don't try to collaborate and figure out how we can work together. And they do that, but I just wanted to kind of clarify that, because if you're not familiar with it, you're like, what is going on? So I know the next thing is that we provide actionable steps that listeners can implement in their roles. Like, what are some things that, we could do right now that might help us move forward with this or adhere to it or align to it?
So if your district doesn't already have this in place, regularly screening and monitoring students, especially those at the elementary level and those that move into the district through their school career. It's important that we screen all students so that we notice those gaps or difficulties as early as possible. If students are identified as struggling in the area of math, then we provide interventions for them, and we have to monitor how those interventions are working, what changes need to be made, and to understand how specific interventions for a smaller gap are implementing their overall understanding of math, how that's carrying over to them as mathematicians.
So, Dr. Lorton, I hear lots of intervention information, which is an MTSS or a multi-tiered system of support piece that really goes right into one of the things I think would be useful action steps that listeners could do is to help teachers find time to have that professional learning together. So whether it's on professional development days or in PLCs, but finding that time for them to collaborate so that they do know what interventions might work. The special education teachers probably have a whole different bag of tools in their toolbox for helping with interventions. Another way that I think really, and I know I've mentioned it a couple of times, but incorporating those special education teachers into that curriculum writing process for the district. As they become part of it, they start to take ownership of the curriculum that they are helping to teach and are preparing their students to teach. And it also gives them time to work on building those progressions.
And I know we've mentioned this a couple of times, but, making sure that teachers, curriculum specialists, or administrators make it a priority to include special education staff in discussions for those resource adoptions, making schedules that provide collaboration time, and also making sure to include both of those types of teachers in professional development opportunities.
I'm thinking about how to make this collaboration feel like a natural process. I feel like we need to have those SPED teachers in those regular ed classrooms. And so in order for that to happen, that would look like more of that push-in model, where the SPED teachers are kind of pushing in, working with students rather than pulling them out. I feel like sometimes it becomes so isolated and we're in our different little silos working, and then we don't really know what's going on in the other areas. And so that push-in may be something to consider. In a perfect world, ideally, if it could be possible, having at least one SPED teacher per grade level would be ideal. I think when we're talking about this collaboration, a lot of the problem sometimes is the scheduling, and a SPED teacher can't be at all of these different places and all these different grades at one time. And so they end up not being at any of them. But if we had one SPED teacher per grade level that's just working, say, my fifth grade teacher's just working with fifth grade, they'd be at those planning meetings, they'd be at those PLC meetings, and they could be a regular part of all of those conversations. And that would be a huge development in that collaboration process that would really kind of push us a giant step forward in that collaboration.
And I feel like in the secondary level, not per grade level, because wow, that would be a lot of kids for one SPED teacher, but per content area, like one or two, even depending on the size of your school, for math, one or two for social studies, one or two for science, one or two for, I think would be beneficial for the same reasons that Dr. Evans mentioned.
Well, and I think that two things that you guys are talking about that I think would help is an actionable piece when you're pushing in. If I am a special ed teacher and I push into a math class, I'm going to see the math teacher teach the content and I'm going to understand it, because let's face it, when was the last time I learned math, right? And then I can be like, oh, this was how they did it. This is how they taught it. Now I can go and help and offer some supports. So again, it's kind of like I'm learning at the same time the students learning, but because I have done this and I do have a more education, I can learn it at a faster rate and all of those things. And then I can apply what strategies are the best for those students to tackle that. So I think that helps build that content knowledge for that special educator. But then I also think about when you mentioned thinking about Algebra 1 or thinking about a grade level expert, one thing that I don't know if we've mentioned it yet or not, but I know we talked about it before we got onto this podcast. And that was that a lot of times special educators, when they start working with students, they work on goals, and their goals might be like, let's say it's a fifth grade student, their goals might be a first or second grade goal. And so they're missing that fifth grade level content. And so if I was only on working with fifth grade, I feel that as a special educator, I would have a better understanding of what the fifth grade expectations were. And then I've got my content, my personal expertise knowledge of what a first or second grade goal is. And then I know I've got to bridge that gap. Am I wrong in thinking that that could help with that piece?
Absolutely. I think that is a great way to explain what we're trying to say. Yes.
This is why the English person is like hosting it, because I'm like, explain this in not in better terms, but like you guys have all these math words going on. I'm like, I don't know what that means.
I know that when I co-taught, which was lots of years, I loved co-teaching. I had 5 or 6 different co-teachers during my time teaching. Each one, we had like a different method for co-teaching, but in all of them, many of the students had no idea who was the special education teacher and who was the content teacher. And they would look to both of us to get help on any of the things. And I learned as much from my co-teacher in how to work with students with disabilities as I feel like she learned about how to teach math. And so I do think that it's a give and take. Like it's not a one-way street when we're talking about pushing in services.
I will say it is beautiful when you walk into a co-taught classroom and you can't tell who's the content expert or who's the special educator. But in saying that, I will say that that comes with confidence and competence. Because if you've thrown me into a math class and I've never had to do this before, I'm not going to feel competent or confident in interjecting. And so that kind of goes back into that professional learning piece that is extremely important. But it is beautiful when you see that happen, or you get to experience, or you're a part of it. It is amazing what happens in a classroom.
And it took more than 1 year for that to happen. But when it did, it was amazing for me, amazing for her, amazing for the kids. Like more importantly, amazing for the kids.
There's so many different models of how that co-teaching could work. There's parallel teaching, there's coaching in there, there's different ways that it could work. And so I think when we're also talking about professional development, some of that, it's not just throwing 2 teachers together and saying, hey, you guys are co-teaching. There's a lot of prep work and a lot of planning and discussion and collaboration that happens before that piece would even begin.
Now we're going to switch gears and we want to talk about what challenges will district leaders face, instructional coaches, teachers, and how they can overcome or prepare for them, because we know that with any change, there comes challenges.
So just like for the district level recommendations that we just talked through, NCTM and CEC also came out with recommendations for teachers, instructional coaches, administration. Like, what should we do? And the first one is to incorporate universal design for learning framework in unit and lesson planning. And I know Dr. Evans really talked about what it was, but as far as instructional coaches, they need to know what those universal design for learning, what that framework looks like, and how to coach teachers to use the ideas and really give them permission to use the ideas, that it's best for students. And then collect ideas. Those instructional coaches can collect ideas from other teachers on strategies that are working to support those universal designs for learning, so that they can then share those tools that they've seen in other classrooms with teachers who maybe need a new idea on how to support their teachers. Teachers need to know what those universal supports or those universal designs for learning are, so they can provide them for students, and they need to know how to implement them, which all goes back to that professional learning. They also need to recognize how to support students at all of the levels of a progression of learning for every standard, so that they are not just focused on the end game, so that they can support students wherever they are as they're growing to that end game.
I think as district content leaders and our district SPED leaders, we're going to need to work together to kind of create this plan and then find the funds to be found to provide that professional development and training, because these are pretty big organizational and individual systematic changes that need to occur, especially when we're talking about creating a different framework, when we're talking about the co-teaching and we're talking about the universal design framework. So thinking about the timing of when this could happen, it may need to be looked at. I know we talked about this briefly, of looking at where districts are in their curriculum cycle, and then thinking, okay, where is this going to fit? Because it's not We can't just add it on top of something else. It'll kind of need to be implemented with where we're at in each of our curriculum cycles.
So you're not saying to just, I'm looking for a book, but you're not saying just, hey, do all this right now, because it's a lot.
For sure.
Absolutely. I think we'd turn a lot of people off if that was the recommendation, to do it all now. Another recommendation that they made was to use appropriate and accurate multiple representations, such as simultaneously presenting concrete, semi-concrete, and abstract. So we talked a little bit about this. And as part of that, districts need to ensure that our digital and physical manipulatives are provided to both the special education teachers and the regular education teachers to use with their students, how to use them, because just handing them a box of manipulatives does not ensure that they know how to use them. Showing them how to model using manipulatives that might not be on grade level. Because some special education teachers might be in a co-taught setting or a push-in setting where they need to utilize manipulatives at maybe a third grade level to support a fifth grade student, or at a sixth grade level trying to support an Algebra 1 student. So showing them that progression of how to use those manipulatives as well. We really want our special education teachers to be able to support the classroom teachers with that instruction using all of those different representations.
Yeah, we know also that it's essential for young children in developing a deeper understanding of math that they use a developmental progression. So whether it's for number sense and calculations, which is oftentimes with the younger children what we think of as math, but also in geometry, measurement, patterning, all of those things that go into all of those different strands of math, and making sure that there is a developmental progression that occurs as students are learning so that they have a solid foundation and then build upon that foundation.
And the good news is that many of our new mathematical resources that districts have now or that we may be purchasing incorporate this. So that's the good news. So the challenge maybe is that many of our special education teachers have not had learning around how to do all of this. And so when we talked earlier about if you're adopting a new resource, bringing in those fed teachers as part of that professional development and learning how to do all of that with our regular education teachers.
So another recommendation for our instructional coaches, our teachers, is to plan proactively using a preventative model for instruction. So being proactive, providing time for those special education and regular education teachers to create those progressions for the standards to help identify where students are in their learning. Instructional coaches can help special ed teachers who are not math certified to understand the progressions and how to teach students through the progressions so that they do feel like they can support. Natalie was talking about having that confidence, giving them that confidence that they do know how to teach and support students.
When we think about when our teachers are sped and our regular teachers are going to have time to plan proactively using that model, we have to think about scheduling, right? So a lot of times our schedules are set at the beginning of the year, especially in elementary, and then that's our schedule. So as I think an opportune time to kind of start to think about how we could start planning proactively together is as you're preparing for those building schedules for next year, and as you're setting that. So considering and providing time for when are our SPED and regular education teachers going to be able to collaborate. If we're not intentional about making sure that we've blocked our scheduling and blocked our time for it, I mean, let's be honest, it's not going to happen, right?
So along with that, another suggestion or another recommendation is that we position students with disabilities as valuable owners and contributors of the mathematics being learned. So just like making sure that we have given the teachers time, we also want to make sure we put those students in a place where they can be owners and contributors to the math being learned. So a suggestion for our teachers, coaches, district level administrators is to, and I go back to something that Dr. Lorton mentioned earlier, that screening, helping teachers place students in the least restrictive environment based on their screenings, based on their IEP information, and working to have students stay in or be in the regular education setting as much as possible so that they do get that tier 1 instruction. They can prioritize special education classrooms that have teachers who know and understand math, professional learning to support special education teachers to learn the content, and then co-taught classrooms to support students with on-grade level content. Now, this might mean more staff, which goes back to that funding thing, because if, like Natalie talked about earlier, making sure that we aren't spreading our teachers so thin. If they need to learn math and that's the content that they're going to be focused on, don't ask them, or don't try not to have them in lots of other content areas so that they can support students with on-grade level content.
Yeah, and if students do need to be pulled out of the classroom for support in their math learning based on their IEP, ensuring that they are in their regular classroom for tier 1 instruction so that they are exposed to that grade level content is something to work towards as well.
So Sherri, I'm so glad you brought that up because that's such an important thing that must be a priority, that our students with disabilities are provided that access to those grade level standards, and not just to whatever their goal they're working on. And so when we think about that, it also includes things like when we're doing number talks or when we're having those really rich mathematical discussions. Many times our SPED students might not be a part of those. And so as much as possible, ensuring that they are a part of all of those those conversations is really important.
And Stephanie, that's exactly what I was thinking. Teachers can provide those low floor, high ceiling prompts so that every student has an entry level into the learning, giving every student that place where they can jump in, providing time for students to discover and discuss the content. And I believe it was Stephanie, you mentioned that a lot of our resources now have that embedded in there, but providing that time for them to discover. And then instructional coaches can help teachers understand how to facilitate those conversations and discovery lessons, because for some teachers, that is a new way of thinking about teaching that maybe they've never facilitated before. And so it becomes a struggle for them.
I will say that I'm a huge advocate for having classroom discussions around topics or ideas because we grow whenever we start hearing other people talk or we gain a different understanding. And so if there's anything that a math teacher or a special education teacher has learned from this podcast, it would be me listening to you guys talk and then asking questions and getting a better understanding of what that looks like. And so I think it is extremely important that, Dr. Evans mentioned that, like, so all too often we pull kids out during that discussion time because we think, well, it's not explicit instruction. It's not direct instruction. They're not going to learn anything. They will probably learn more in that discussion with their peers, like processing through, than they would from that direct instruction. And so I think it is important to realize that those discussions are key components to the learning. And that's what we do as learners. Like, we ask questions, we have conversations with other people so that we have a better understanding.
Which fits right with the next recommendation. Provide paired time for students to share and rehearse their thinking and ideas in multimodal ways before moving to a whole group discussion, so that they do have that time, like you were talking about, Natalie, to think, to talk, to make those connections. And one thing that instructional coaches can do is to learn about the ripple effect of instruction that's highlighted in the total participation techniques, Making Every Student an Active Learner book by Persida and William Hemley. It encourages students to think individually first, share with a partner, share with a team, and then the whole class. So it starts little and ripples out to the whole class. It gives your students that time to think and to validate their understanding or adjust their thinking even prior to having that whole group conversation, where sometimes if you start with the whole group, one student does the talking and one student does the learning. Where with the ripple method, it starts individually and works its way out.
And that goes really right along with what Works Clearinghouse has found, that There is a strong evidence to show that students learn mathematics and solve problems better when they monitor their thinking and their problem-solving steps as they solve the problem. So when students think about what they're doing and why they're doing it, they're not just learning the math, but they're learning how to evaluate the steps that they are taking to solve the problem and how to use those steps, how to make necessary changes, how to solve other problems that they encounter that may be similar or maybe different. That process helps students connect new concepts to what they already know. And we know that the more that they reflect on their problem solving processes, the better their mathematical reasoning is, and the better their ability to apply this reasoning to new situations will be.
Yeah, and I think about with many of our students with disabilities, sometimes it's a processing speed. And so having this component also allows those students with slower processing speeds that additional time before responding. And so giving that little bit of a break, and that encourages that critical thinking. And just like we were talking about, promotes that higher quality participation from more students. And this benefits not only our students with disabilities, but all of our students. We all know how important that wait time is, and having that time to be able to talk something out before we share it out with everybody.
So another one would be to provide a variety of interactive learning experiences.
So that goes right along with that paired time for thinking, because when we give those interactive learning experiences, students are touching, feeling, working with those concrete, semi-concrete, and abstract representations. But instructional coaches and teachers have to know how to incorporate those into their classrooms. Districts prioritize making sure that they have the resources for that interactive learning experiences so that they can embed them not only in the regular ed classrooms, but also the special education classrooms. Again, the professional learning on how to utilize those and what are the interactive learning experiences that students could play around with.
So some ways that when I think about what are interactive learning experiences, I think about virtual manipulatives. I think about those engaging math games, project-based learning, or having students work on real-world projects that require them to apply those math concepts that we're teaching to solve those problems. And then even using like real data sets as we're talking about analyzing trends and patterns. So just some ideas of what they mean by interactive learning experiences.
Glad that you clarified that, Dr. Evans, because I think I teach secondary English, and when I think about that term of interactive learning, I think of a Kahoot or like something on the computer that kids are doing. And I think that it expands beyond that, and it's not just a computer-based thing. It could physically be manipulatives that they are moving with their hands in that tactile kinesthetic approach. So another one is to use flexible grouping structures to cultivate a community of learning. What does that look like?
In the classroom, teachers, they can learn and implement those universal supports, or that universal design for learning, knowing that it's beneficial for all students in the classroom, and that flexible grouping is one of those pieces. In the book, The Flexibly Grouped Classroom, How to Organize Learning for Equity and Growth by Christina Dubé, they highlight a variety of methods for grouping students for different purposes, but all highlighting student learning. So being intentional about how you group students and why you're grouping them that way becomes a method to create that community in your classroom, but it also helps to bolster what learning you're hoping to happen in your classroom. Another one, the book Building Thinking Classrooms by Peter Liljeday. I'll get that
That's a
right.
mouthful.
So Peter Liljeday, he recommends random grouping so that students can learn with and from each other. So every day he recommends putting different students together for different learning. But thinking about that flexible grouping really helps your students all feel included. And I know Dr. Lorton and Dr. Evans have both mentioned making sure that our classrooms are inclusive.
I think the piece that is kind of the other side of this is that ability grouping. And so I think this recommendation of using flexible grouping is moving us away from those rigid ability groups. So putting students in groups based on level and then keeping them in those groups. And so that flexible grouping is really, if we are grouping a little bit on some ability, they have they're not stagnant in that. They have opportunities to move out and to move into different groupings. And so I think that's the piece that I think about is the difference between that ability grouping.
Well, and I think that there's just that stigma that kids are smart, whether you're a first grader or you're a 12th grader. Kids know that I'm in the low group. Like if they're constantly with the same people all the time, they're like, I'm in the low group. And so as a teacher, how can you make those groups more flexible so that there isn't the stigma of I'm always in this group? Like back in the day, it was like the bluebirds. So the final recommendation is to build meaningful connections between concepts and procedures.
So if you think about everything we've talked about, creating those flexible groups, having those interactive learning experiences, giving think time, making them owners of their learning, being proactive with our models for instruction, and then having multiple representations, all encompasses this last recommendation. We want to build those meaningful connections, and we're going to use all the things that we've talked about above to build those connections between the concepts and the procedures so that we're building students who understand the concepts. They're not just cranking a wheel on an algorithm and pops out the answer. We don't want that. We want students to have those conversations, to be in groups where they can learn, to use manipulatives, to use a variety of learning models, to have access to the material. And so NCTM and CEC really just want us to do all of those things to help build that connection between the concepts and the procedures so that students, all students, special education students and regular education students, have those connections.
So when I also think about that concepts and procedures, is it wrong for me to maybe think it from this perspective that the concepts are the math teachers and the procedures are the special education teachers? And not that there aren't concepts and procedures in the other two, but that idea of like bringing those two together is what this statement is all about. That's Natalie's terms.
Go ahead.
I said that's Natalie's terms.
Right. I never looked at it from that perspective, but when you're thinking about it from the teacher end, yes, what we teach and how we teach it would be the concepts and procedures. I was thinking about it from the student perspective. The concepts are the big ideas and the procedures are those algorithms that get the answer, because we want students to have an understanding of what they're learning and what they're doing. But I like your thinking too, because I think that's twofold. Teachers need to have the concepts and how to teach them effectively.
I also think of it as when we're building those connections, but I also think of it as I'm able to apply it into all different kinds of settings. So because I understand the connection between these concepts and procedures, whenever I need to be flexible and apply it to a new situation, I'm able to do. I kind of think of it that way.
So anything else that we want to add to? I know we've covered a lot. When I think about just this, there's a lot going on here, and I feel that we could probably have different podcasts or conversations around each one of them even more in depth than what we have. And I feel like barely skimmed the surface. But one thing that I noticed that was said over and over and over again throughout all of this is the universal design for learning. And I don't know if that is a whole nother podcast in itself to just really break that down, because it literally came up over and over and over again. And I know that there are books out there that teachers can pick up and read, or I'm sure that you could listen to other podcasts, but that might be something that we also explore in an upcoming situation, because I do feel that there was a lot of conversation around that and what that looks like. So I want to thank each one of you guys for coming today and enlightening me on this topic of the National Council of Teachers Mathematics and the CEC's recommendation or their position statement on including all learners, so that everyone has access to grade level content in every subject area, but specifically in math. I hope that these insights help you navigate your educational journey more clearly and confidently. Please feel free to share your thoughts or experiences. We'd love to hear from you. And if you found today's episode valuable, consider sharing it with a colleague who might benefit from this message.